Before we turn things over to our speaker tonight, I first want to make some acknowledgments, first to our friends of the Byrd Center. These programs are made possible by the support of a growing and vibrant community of donors and supporters who believe in the Byrd Center's mission of advancing representative democracy and preserving the history of the United States Constitution and Congress through programs like this and through our myriad civics education initiatives and our archival projects here at the center. These programs are not possible without your support. The Byrd Center is a private nonprofit entity on the campus of Shepherd University, and we rely on our generous donors to make excellent programs like this a reality. We also have some very special people to thank tonight for making this particular program possible. They are Drs. Howard Wachtel and Dr. Marie Tyler McGraw, both friends of the Byrd Center, and I'm sure people who are familiar to many of you tonight. They have been instrumental in getting Pat to us and making tonight's event possible, and we're very grateful for their support. We also want to thank Four Seasons Bookstore here in Shepherdstown, who has had copies of Justice Rising for sale for the past few months, and who tomorrow will be hosting a signing with Patricia Sullivan from 2 to 3 p.m. So if you would like to get a copy of Justice Rising signed by tonight's speaker, head over to Four Seasons tomorrow. That's Friday, October 15th, between 2 and 3 p.m. And you get a chance to meet tonight's speaker. So all of the Byrd Center's programs this semester are being handled remotely for COVID-19 safety precautions, which means that a recording of this program will be available on YouTube within the next few days, as well as all of the past few months of programs, which you can check out on Byrd Center's YouTube channel. And as we listen to tonight's lecture, I invite you and encourage you to submit questions for our speaker in the chat box. And after her remarks, I will voice the questions to her. So with that, I want to turn things over to Dr. Howard Wachtel to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Jody, and welcome everyone. It's a distinct privilege for me to welcome Patricia Sullivan to Shepherdstown and to the Byrd Center. Patricia Sullivan is the William Arthur Ferry II Professor of History at the University of South Carolina. She was a fellow of the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard University, where for many years she co-directed their summer institute on teaching the history of the civil rights movement. It's very difficult to introduce Pat because there's so much in her background, but I'll just pull out a few highlights. Her previous books include Lift Every Voice, which is a history of the NAACP, Freedom Writer, Virginia Foster Durr, and Days of Hope, Race and Democracy in the New Deal. She is an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer, and also is a member of the Advisory Committee of the Civil Rights Project of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. In recognition of her scholarly contributions to history, Sullivan has been awarded many prestigious grants in support of her research, including twice awarded residencies at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, a distinguished visiting scholar of the John W. Klug Center of the Library of Congress, the William C. and Ida Friday Senior Fellow of the National Humanities Center, and also the recipient of a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. At the University of South Carolina, Sullivan teaches courses on 20th century United States history, with particular interest in African American history and the history of the civil rights movement. As Jody mentioned, she'll be in person tomorrow at Four Seasons Books which is on German Street in Shepherdstown, for those of you who are out of town, to sign the books, which I know you have bought or will buy. And you can continue the conversation with her tomorrow. So it's a very great pleasure for me to welcome Pat to Shepherdstown and to the Byrd Center.
Thank you, Howard, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to give a special thanks to you and to Marie Tyler McGraw, my dear longtime friends, for the invitation for me to speak here at the Robert C. Byrd Center and for all they've done to help organize this event. I'm also very grateful to Jody Brummage for going above and beyond in making this evening possible. Finally, thanks to all of you out there on Zoom and my small audience here for joining us tonight. It is wonderful to be here in West Virginia. This is my first visit to Shepherdstown, but this is the state that made John Kennedy's election possible. Stories about the 1960 West Virginia primary tell about piles of cash and shady deals. I don't know about that. What interested me was the Kennedys' shock at the poverty and suffering they saw in destitute mining towns, which was a formative experience for both of them. I was also struck by their outreach to Black voters in a state where there are very few African Americans, very small, maybe 5% of the state back then. Robert Kennedy organized a campaign event for the candidate at Bluefield State College, a historically Black college in the southern part of the state. When asked about the sit-ins, which had just started that February, JFK said they were in the great tradition of peaceful American protest. When a student asked about school desegregation, he said it would be enforced if he was elected, not just as the law, but the moral spirit of the Brown decision. So that was a good moment. I'll begin my talk by briefly discussing an episode that opens my book, Justice Rising. In May 1963, widely televised images of police assaulting young Black protesters with dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham, Alabama, ignited street demonstrations across the country. James Baldwin's warning in The Fire Next Time, published earlier that year, seemed to be on the verge of being realized. On May 24th, in a meeting arranged by James Baldwin, Attorney General Robert Kennedy met privately with Baldwin and a small group of African Americans, including playwright Lorraine Hansberry, attorney Clarence Jones, sociologist Kenneth Clark, and Jerome Smith, a young battle-scarred veteran of the sit-ins and the freedom rides. Kennedy was looking to this group for advice on how to calm racial tensions while he and his brother tried to build congressional support for a strong civil rights bill. But Jerome Smith set the tone. Being in the room with Kennedy, he said, made him want to vomit. For the next 3 hours, the group unleashed a litany of charges and complaints about the failure of the federal government to protect the rights and lives of Black citizens and its complicity in segregation. Kennedy's efforts to respond were cut off. Finally, he just sat and listened. It went on for 3 hours. Kenneth Clark described it as the most violent verbal assault he had ever witnessed. I did not start out to write a book on Robert Kennedy. I was interested in taking a fresh look at the 1960s, a decade that began with mass nonviolent protests in the South and ended with the explosion of racial tensions in cities across the country, along with the burgeoning politics of law and order and white backlash. The meeting with Baldwin and several other incidents involving Robert Kennedy piqued my interest. I soon realized that Kennedy's public life, in ways that I had never understood, was forged at the intersection of race, history, and politics that drove the dynamics of change in the 1960s. 1960, the year that JFK ran for president, marked the convergence of several major developments. The sit-ins that began in Greensboro in February 1960, as I mentioned, sparked mass protests throughout the South. initiating the culminating years of the civil rights movement. 1960 also topped off the decade of the largest migration of African Americans from the South to cities in the North and West, amplifying the power of Black voters who had emerged as a major voting bloc in northern states. Migration since World War I, the World War I era, had also changed the racial demographics of the country. By 1960, nearly half of African Americans had lived outside of the South and segregated into overcrowded, poverty-stricken urban communities. The Kennedy campaign, managed by Brother Bobby, was by all accounts a brilliant upstart operation with one goal: to win. As Democrats, they faced the difficult proposition of securing Black votes in key northern industrial states and holding on to the South at a time of rising Black protest and fierce white defense of segregation. In the process of threading that needle, the Kennedy brothers' exposure to racial realities in the country grew, and the problem of race became more than a political calculation. After his razor close victory, John Kennedy insisted that his reluctant brother accept the position of Attorney General. He emphasized the challenges ahead and predicted that civil rights would be the dominant domestic issue. And this is a quote from JFK. "I want someone who's going to be strong, who will join me in taking whatever risks, who will deal with the problem honestly," he told Bobby. "We're going to have to change the climate in this country," JFK said. "If my administration does the things I want to do, I'm going to have someone as Attorney General to carry these things out on whom I can rely completely." In his first interview as Attorney General, Robert Kennedy let it be known that the Justice Department would not tolerate defiance of court orders in the South, but also noted that ground had to be prepared for sweeping change. He commented on the hypocrisy of people in the North, quote, "whose lives indicate that they would rather talk about integration than live it." He built a remarkable team of attorneys and selected Burke Marshall to head the Civil Rights Division. Kennedy and Marshall went on to form a partnership that would mark the beginning of a sea change in civil rights policies. They were entering uncharted waters and would test the reach of federal power in ways not attempted since the Reconstruction era. Robert Kennedy's attention was drawn to the national reach of racial discrimination and division. And for me, learning about how he confronted and attempted to grapple with its many manifestations revealed how deep the challenges were. And though I won't discuss it tonight, the book describes how RFK focused on conditions created by segregation and entrenched poverty in urban areas in the North and West. Starting in the spring of 1961, he visited with youth in poor urban areas and established a federal program that created 16 community-based projects to deal with jobs, education, recreation, criminal justice issues, projects that laid the groundwork for what would become the community action programs of the War on Poverty. But from 1961 through 1963, the Kennedy administration was really drawn to the South, and their time paralleled the peak years of the civil rights movement. And at this time, powerful Southern Democrats dominated a Congress where Democrats held a slight majority, making prospects for strong civil rights legislation next to nil. The administration initially relied on executive action, and most of all on the Justice Department, where RFK moved quickly to use all the tools at their disposal to enforce school desegregation and voting rights laws. Now, for Robert Kennedy, enforcement of voting rights seemed to be the key to tackling deeply entrenched system of segregation. The Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960 had enhanced the power of the Justice Department to sue officials for unjust tactics to bar Black citizens from registering. Over the course of 2 years, RFK more than quadrupled the number of lawyers working in the Civil Rights Division and created a field operation of attorneys. They spent weeks at a time in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, investigating voter discrimination, collecting evidence, and litigating cases county by county, filing more than 35 cases. And their work aligned with with Bob Moses and SNCC activists who began an intensive voter registration campaign in Mississippi in the summer of 1961. Like the activists, Justice Department attorneys found that the entire process, from the registrars to the courts, was geared to stall and obstruct the registration of Black voters with the sanction of local and state officials. Now, early on, Robert Kennedy realized that the pace of change was beyond his control. In May 1961, 13 Black and white women and men left Washington and traveled by bus into the Deep South, testing the enforcement of a Supreme Court decision barring segregation in interstate travel. The Freedom Rides were Robert Kennedy's baptism. A mob firebombed one of the buses in Anniston, Alabama, where riders barely escaped with their lives. Riders on a second bus were assaulted by men wielding bats, chains, and steel pipes in Birmingham while the police stood by. Governor John Patterson refused to take calls from the president and gave no sign that he would protect the riders. Bobby Kennedy sent his top aide to Alabama and practically lived in his office during the course of nearly 10 days of this, monitoring the situation and working to secure the safe passage of the riders. After riders were assaulted in Montgomery, Kennedy dispatched 500 marshals to provide the protection that the governor refused to provide. The marshals were the only law enforcement force present during a packed mass meeting at the First Baptist Church when a mob of several thousand whites threatened to burn the church down. A horrific disaster had been barely prevented before the governor finally sent in the National Guard. Kennedy negotiated safe passage for the riders to Jackson, Mississippi, where they were promptly arrested for breaching the peace. That fall, he obtained an ICC ruling enforcing the court's desegregation ruling. And in the aftermath, Kennedy, commenting on the governor and the public officials in Alabama, told Attorney John Doerr, quote, "Those fellows are at war with this country." A little more than a year later, the Kennedys faced a major showdown with Governor Ross Barnett when a federal court order mandated the admission of James Meredith to the University of Mississippi. The governor publicly preached defiance and withdrew all police protection from the campus on the day Meredith was scheduled to enroll. After Justice Department attorneys and federal marshals quietly got Marshall into his dorm room, more than 1,000 people rioted on the campus. 2 people were killed, and it took 25,000 Army troops to restore order. Meredith enrolled the next day. New York reporter Claude Sitton called it the most serious state-federal conflict since the Civil War. The University of Alabama loomed as a major battleground in the late spring of 1963, following again a court order mandating the admission of Vivian Malone and James Hood. George Wallace, the fiery governor, was angling to emerge as a leading defender of segregation. During his inauguration that January, Wallace famously declared, "Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." On April 24th, Robert Kennedy headed to Montgomery, Alabama, to meet face-to-face with Wallace, wanting to size him up and let him know that the court order would be enforced. At a press conference upon his arrival, a local reporter asked, "Mr. Kennedy, are you a communist?" "No," he answered. "I would be glad to clarify that." The governor had the Confederate flag hoisted over the state capitol the day before Robert Kennedy's visit, and it would remain there for more than 30 years. Wallace greeted Kennedy by announcing that he was going to tape their conversation, which meant that Kennedy could not let anything Wallace say go by unchallenged, since excerpts would likely be played on the local radio station. Wallace charged that the central government was trying to rewrite all the laws and said the administration was determined to enforce segregation with troops and bayonets. Kennedy countered each one of the governor's exaggerated claims and misstatements and emphasized the responsibility of the federal government to ensure the rulings of the federal courts were abided by. It went on for 90 minutes. Kennedy emerged from the meeting slightly shaken, in the words of a reporter, but with a fuller grasp of the politics and culture of white defiance. Quote, "It's like a foreign country," he said. "There's no communication. What do you do? I've never been asked if I was communist before. Now, Martin Luther King's campaign targeting segregation in Birmingham's department stores was underway by the time Kennedy went to meet with Wallace. A week after the Wallace-Kennedy summit, Birmingham seized headlines across the country and around the world when Bull Connor's police force assaulted protesters as young as 7 with dogs and fire hoses. Demonstrations erupted across the country, while violent confrontations between police and protesters continued in Birmingham, and Klansmen bombed the hotel, set off a bomb at the hotel that King had just left, pushing the city to the verge of a race war. Burke Marshall played a critical role in negotiating an agreement that provided for the desegregation of the downtown department stores and establishing a fragile peace. The Kennedy brothers saw urgency and opportunity in the Birmingham crisis. Black frustration and anger were at the breaking point across the country. Meanwhile, the violence in Birmingham had focused national attention on conditions in the South, providing an opening for mobilizing public opinion behind the passage of a strong civil rights bill. Bobby Kennedy's team drafted legislation in mid-May, and the administration began a multi-front effort to secure its passage and cool racial tensions. Nearly all of President Kennedy's top aides were against introducing a strong civil rights bill, warning that it would threaten the president's other legislative initiatives. Also, with the presidential election on the horizon, they argued that JFK risked losing Southern states while not fully satisfying African Americans. Vice President Lyndon Johnson advised against the bill, warning it could not pass and would just cause trouble. As Burke Marshall recalled, quote, "The conclusive voice within the government for a civil rights bill was Robert Kennedy. He urged it, he felt it, he understood it, and he prevailed. I don't think anyone else, except the president himself, felt that way on the issue." A reporter from the Washington Post described, quote, "a formless sense of urgent struggle emanating from the White House. There was a realization that most Americans do not understand the civil rights problem or grasp the seriousness of the situation." From May into June, the Kennedys and top officials met with congressional leadership and concentrated on enlisting the support of Republicans. They would need at least 25 Republicans to defeat a Southern filibuster. At the same time, Robert and John Kennedy initiated a round of meetings with owners of stores, restaurants, and theaters in the South, urging them to act now and voluntarily desegregate their establishments, assuring them that the action would soon be mandated by law. And it was during this really volatile period that Robert Kennedy had met with James Baldwin and his group. The showdown with Wallace, who pledged to personally block the entry of the 2 students to the University of Alabama, loomed. On June 11th, after a tense and highly theatrical confrontation between the governor and federal officials, namely Nicholas Katzenbach, on the campus of the University of Alabama, Vivian Malone and James Hood were enrolled. Now, by this time, the Justice Department had obtained a federal court injunction forbidding Wallace from blocking the enrollment of the students, and the judge made it clear that if he did, the punishment would include jail time. So that may have had an influence. With the Alabama crisis behind him, John Kennedy decided to go on national television that night to appeal directly to the nation and announce that he would introduce a major civil rights bill. He and his brother hastily outlined what JFK would say just minutes before the president went before the television cameras. The speech, which I urge you to read if you've not read, was a distillation of what both brothers had experienced over the previous 2.5 years. And I'll just offer a few highlights from it. Racial discrimination, the president began, is not a sectional issue, but a condition that existed in every city, every state of the Union. 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs are not fully free. They are not freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet free from social and economic oppression. Now the time has come for the nation to fulfill its promises, he insisted. The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south, where legal remedies are not at hand. They were, the president emphasized, manifestations of a moral crisis that could not be resolved by repressive police action, by tokenism, or by deploring the facts. This was a time for action in Congress, in state and local government, and above all, in our daily lives. He continued, a great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all. Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence. Those who act boldly are recognizing right as well as reality. Kennedy ended his speech by announcing that he would ask Congress to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century, to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law. On June 19th, JFK sent the Civil Rights Bill to Congress. Hearings that summer kept a spotlight on the legislation. Protests and violent clashes with police continued, with major crises in Danville, Virginia, and Cambridge, Maryland. JFK tried to discourage a planned march on Washington, fearing that any incidents could undermine congressional support for the Civil Rights Bill. When Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph made it clear that the march would go forward, RFK assigned several aides to work with march organizers in securing facilities, managing traffic, setting up food and water stations, and doing what they could to ensure its success. And Howard Wachtel was among the young volunteers. He was a young Corps volunteer who served as a marshal at the March on Washington. And to hear him talk about it puts you right there in what really was a remarkable moment. During summer months and into the fall, the Kennedys succeeded in enlisting the support and collaboration of key Republican leaders, notably Congressman William McCulloch, the ranking Republican on the House Judiciary Committee. During hearings on the final form of the bill before the Judiciary Committee in October, the strategy nearly unraveled when several Democrats added more provisions, upending the agreement that Kennedy had made with the Republican leadership. McCulloch called the bill a pail of garbage. In a high wire act that really displayed his brilliant political talent, John Kennedy got the Democrats in line and worked out a strategy for salvaging the bill and its Republican support. The Judiciary Committee passed legislation on November 20th, 1963, and this basically would be the bill that Lyndon Johnson would sign on July 2nd, carried to passage by the coalition that the Kennedys had put together. And as we all know, on November 22nd, President Kennedy was assassinated. Shattering was how friends described Robert Kennedy in the aftermath of the assassination. Some of the observers have said that JFK's assassination changed Bobby Kennedy and made him into a passionate advocate for racial and economic justice. People closest to him disagreed. Quote, he certainly was different in the immediate aftermath, Burke Marshall said, but he was basically the same person. As my research revealed, his experiences as Attorney General, what he saw and what he came to understand, prepared him for the work he would do now that he was on his own. Kennedy remained Attorney General through August 1964 and saw the passage of the Civil Rights Act through. President Lyndon Johnson left it to RFK and his team to determine strategy and lead in moving the bill through the Senate filibuster. And while Robert Kennedy believed the passage of the bill was essential, as much as a sign of good faith to African Americans as to dismantling the South's Jim Crow system, he knew that greater challenges lay ahead. Anyone who thinks this law is going to make the problem go away, he told reporters, is out of his mind. Elected senator from New York, Robert Kennedy began his term in January 1965, at the start of one of the most tumultuous periods in American history. In March, the Johnson administration began a massive bombing campaign in Vietnam and sent in ground troops, making it America's war. That same month, the voting rights campaign in Selma, Alabama, drew national attention after marchers were beaten by police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. President Johnson seized the moment and introduced voting rights legislation that was signed into law on August 5th, 1965, the high water mark of the civil rights movement. 5 days later, after signing the Voting Rights Act, an incident that began with police arresting a young Black motorist in the Watts area of Los Angeles set off 4 days of street battles, which left 34 people dead, 24 of whom were African-American, 1,000 injured, and large sections of the city burned out. There had been urban uprisings and police battles during the previous summer, but the scale of the Watts rebellion shocked the country. The dominant response across the mainstream political spectrum were calls for law and order. Robert Kennedy pushed back, responding to a reporter, quote, "There is no point in telling Negroes to obey the law. To many Negroes, the law is the enemy. In Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant, it has almost always been used against him." Watts marked a turning point for the later 1960s, similar to how the sit-ins in 1960 defined a new phase of the civil rights movement. It forced attention on racial conditions in urban areas. Rebellions would erupt in cities across the country over successive summers. For Robert Kennedy, Watts signaled a crisis which he described as unparalleled in our history. The challenge of meeting the expectations raised by the civil rights movement and addressing the conditions that define the everyday lives of many African Americans living in urban areas, segregation, poverty, dilapidated housing and schools, policing abuses, were enormous. For Kennedy, this meant confronting and challenging the prejudices, fears, ignorance, and indifference that prevented white Americans from facing what he saw as the most urgent domestic crisis of the decade. Just days after Watts, Kennedy addressed a white audience in Spring Valley, New York. He asked them to think about what they valued in their lives and consider the source of their self-esteem. Surely, he said, much of it is built around the work we do. Then he asked them to imagine a community like Watts, where many people were without work. Lack of work meant lack of money, and, quote, living in overcrowded, rat-infested housing, or even renting cars for a night to have a place to live. Such conditions were compounded by blighted hopes and disappointments of those who had left the South for what many called the promised land. They found themselves crowded into, quote, a dirty, stinky, uncared for, closet-sized section of a great city. The children inherited the total lot of their parents, the disappointment, the anger, with little hope for deliverance. He asked, where does one run to when he's already in the promised land? In 1966, Kennedy helped organize 6 weeks of Senate hearings chaired by Abraham Ribicoff of Connecticut, focusing attention on the crisis in America's cities. Close to 100 witnesses appeared, including mayors, cabinet officials, civil rights leaders, Black writers, city planners, housing experts, police officers, clergy, and labor leaders. A comprehensive examination of the nature and causes of the problems that plagued urban areas, Ribicoff and Kennedy believed, was an essential first step to determining how the federal government could and should mobilize the nation's will and direct its resources to meet this national emergency. The hearings were aimed in part to provide a blueprint for a more robust and targeted war on poverty. In a revealing exchange with Kennedy, the writer Ralph Ellison observed the nature of the challenge facing those attempting to chart the course forward. Quote, Ellison said, "We are living in a time of chaos within the total political structure. We do not have the political structures that can contain the energies set loose by the civil rights bills." During his time as senator, Kennedy moved on multiple fronts, traveling the country, seeing conditions in urban areas and migrant camps in Appalachia, Mississippi Delta, on Indian reservations, and listening to people. He brought attention to the issues that concerned him through hearings, speeches, and legislation. In 1966, he initiated a community-run project in Bedford-Stuyvesant as a possible model for community, business, government partnerships dedicated to community restoration and leadership development. And right before he announced this program at the end of '66, he said, I'm not sure it's going to work, but it's going to test some new ideas, some new ways of doing things. Even if we fail, we'll have learned something. But more important than that, something has to be done. People like myself just can't go around making nice speeches all the time. We can't just keep raising expectations. We have some damn hard work to do. And I mean, I can just give you little insights to what's a remarkable period with him and all that's he's moving through and facing, and that's shaping his actions. Exploring his actions and his evolving response to developments during this volatile period shows how Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and others sought to channel the energies, as Ellison pointed out, released but the intensifying efforts to address the consequences of America's racial past and to find a way forward. Kennedy's response to Black Power is instructive, which set a lot of people on edge. In the summer of 1966, the March Against Fear through Mississippi was organized to encourage voter registration. It was met by violent police attacks, prompting Stokely Carmichael's famous call for Black Power. Liberal news media, politicians, and the NAACP's leadership uniformly condemned Carmichael and the whole concept. When a reporter asked Kennedy for his comments, he said that the slogan has been interpreted in various ways. He thought it could raise some technical concerns because he felt that the future of the country depended on Blacks and whites working together. But he went on to praise the March Against Fear for demonstrating that Black citizens would keep up their efforts until they established equality. Kennedy was more concerned with white attitudes and growing backlash. Suppose God is Black, he asked in an article prominently featured along with his image on the cover of Look magazine that summer. The article discussed his trip to South Africa, which he had taken in June, telling of an exchange with a white audience where one person argued that the Bible had taught racial separation as a moral necessity and that God created Black people to serve. As related in the article, in his response, Kennedy said, "But suppose God is Black." When you get to heaven, you find that out. And in the summer of Black Power, such a question invited a fresh angle of vision. Following uprisings in Omaha, Des Moines, Cleveland, Chicago, and other cities in the summer of 1966, key voices in the mainstream media agreed with the findings of the Ribicoff Committee hearings that LBJ's war on poverty had failed to begin to meet the urban crisis. Quote, "The Johnson administration talks good programs, but sets the targets far too low. It is not the riots in the slums, but these lame, inadequate programs that are the real disgrace of the richest nation on earth," editorialized the Times. Tom Foley of the Washington Post wrote that a third summer of riots, quote, "shows that the bargain basement, penny pinching approach does not work." Foley went on to warn that as riots flare from city to city, the bitterness becomes more deep-seated, leading to a breakdown in communication between the races. Then political action becomes impossible. President Johnson avoided talking about the riots, except to say in the summer of 1966 that, quote, "Negro riots jeopardized civil rights gains." He warned African Americans that they were only 10% of the population. He said he was confident that most white people want to see justice and equality given to their fellow citizens, but want to see it come under law. Meanwhile, the Vietnam War continued to crowd out anti-poverty programs as funds were cut and innovative programs like community action were ended. The war on poverty, in Martin Luther King's words, was barely a skirmish. 1967 was a year of escalating crisis and polarization in the United States. With nearly 500,000 ground troops in Vietnam, Johnson's obsessive pursuit of victory in Vietnam had achieved at best a stalemate. The anti-war movement grew exponentially and was more broad-based. That summer of 1967, racial clashes, disorders, and rebellions erupted in an estimated 164 cities, bringing the nation's racial crisis to a boil. Detroit surpassed all others, including Watts, in death and destruction. 43 people were killed, 33 of whom were African-American, more than 2,000 injured, 5,000 arrests, more than 2,000 buildings burned to the ground. Describing the city's charred landscape, Mayor Jerome Kavanaugh said, "It looks like Berlin in 1945. Television coverage, along with newspaper and magazine reports and images, reinforced dominant white opinion of Black urban communities as dangerous, violent, and crime-infested places, and helped justify the militarization of urban policing. In his national address to the country, Lyndon Johnson condemned the violence and looting, which made sense. Then he said the FBI will seek evidence of conspiracy as the cause. He acknowledged that the long-term solution was to attack the conditions that breed despair and violence, and then praised his administration for, quote, directing the greatest government effort in all of American history against these ancient enemies. There was no comment on ramping up anti-poverty programs. Instead, he promised to press for more laws to protect citizens from criminals. In closing, he said, let us pray and let us work for better jobs and better housing and better education for many millions of our fellow citizens in need tonight. That's it, Robert Kennedy told his aide, Frank Mankiewicz, after watching LBJ's televised speech. The president is just not going to do anything more. He is through with domestic problems in cities. Mankiewicz later reflected that the Detroit riots and the terrible feeling Bobby had when he watched Johnson that night had shifted his thinking about running for president in 1968. At the end of that summer, Marion Wright, former SNCC activist and then working as a civil rights lawyer in Mississippi and an aide to Martin Luther King, accompanied Kennedy aide Peter Edelman, who she would later marry, on a visit to Robert Kennedy at his home. Kennedy learned from Wright of King's despair about what to do in the face of the dire conditions in the cities, the failure of the government to recognize the depths of the problem, and the growing backlash. Kennedy told Wright that King should get a lot of poor people who just come to Washington and stay, say they're going to stay until something happens and Congress gets embarrassed and has to act. Wright passed this along to King, who had been thinking about orchestrating nonviolent protests in urban areas. Wright's proposal helped shift King's attention to, quote, the Washington Project, which became the Poor People's Campaign. Justice Rising, my book, describes what happens over the next stretch of months, and it's really very complex and lots going on. But as Kennedy finally is moving towards and decides to declare his candidacy for the presidency, and King organizes the Poor People's Campaign. The spirit and hope of both efforts have been largely overshadowed by their tragic endings. It is important to remember, and this is what I was reminded of as I researched and wrote this book, what each of these individuals had come to represent by this time. While the obstacles facing both of them may have proved insurmountable, the power of their leadership and their vision at this moment should be remembered. Robert Kennedy's energetic barnstorming campaign can be seen as an extension of Ralph Ellison's call for the creation of a political structure capable of channeling the hopes and possibilities released by the civil rights movement, an effort to build a new politics, drawing in African Americans, blue-collar workers, young people, Latinos, Native Americans. When he was assassinated just minutes after winning the California primary, he had a clear chance of winning the nomination and the presidency. I think things might have been very different in this country if we had not had so many assassinations, James Baldwin told Gene Stein in 1970. Baldwin regretted that he had not spoken with Bobby again after the May 1963 meeting. They saw each other one more time at Martin Luther King's funeral across a distance. Now that Bobby was gone, Baldwin reflected on what had been lost. Quote, he was somebody in the 20th century with enough passion and energy and patience. Bobby may have been, quote, exasperated with those people at the infamous 1963 meeting being hit against the wall and described as naive, but, Baldwin said, at least there's some contact, some connection, there's dialogue, there's something that makes things possible. He concluded, you know, Black people had a very different feeling toward government when Bobby and JFK were alive than we've had since. I can't repeat it too often, that is one of the most sinister facts of present day American life. That atmosphere no longer exists. This is 1970. I'll close by quoting Robert Kennedy and his advice to students at the University of California, Berkeley in 1966, a time of crisis, despair, and division in America, words that resonate today. He told them, there is but one choice, to face our difficulties and strive to overcome them, or turn away, bring repression, increasing pain, and civil strife. So thank you all, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sullivan. It was an incredible talk and a wonderful review of such an intriguing life and persona and career. And I think a fitting question to start off, because it follows up on the quote that you used from James Baldwin a bit. We had a question that was that says, being from such a well-known family as the Kennedys, what do you think set Robert Kennedy apart from his brothers, and from what skill or experience or philosophy, or just what really made him such a dynamic leader, in your opinion, through your research?
That's a great question, and that's a question I began my research with when I figured out that he moves, what he did and what was going on in his public life. What prepared him, what shaped him, and I think I looked at prepared him to meet the moment. I think he came in 1960 when the civil rights movement really opened things up and just created both a demand and an opportunity. So he moved into that situation, but he was ready to respond to it in the way he did. And my first chapter is called Misfit. And I look at his early life and think about the experiences, the characteristics that help explain that. And I think one thing is he was a compassionate kid. He was somebody who was, the runt of the litter, kind of marginalized a bit. He exhibited empathy as a child. I mean, there are different references to that and examples. And he had a teacher who said, his academic performance was not great in whatever school he was in, high school, but she said he has a wonderful habit of asking why. And I think that curiosity, so those are all factors. He had a very good liberal arts education, and that prepares you to question assumptions. So I think, and he traveled, he went to the Middle East in 1948 and saw the suffering and struggle with the formation of Israel, went to the, so he had these experiences, and I think all those were important that prepared him. And I think, when he is, in terms of the rest of his family, he's quite extraordinary, but John Kennedy too was, prepared. I found that out in my research, that he was ready. And I think what, for younger people who don't remember those times, haven't studied them, segregation was deeply entrenched throughout the country, and people didn't question it normally. Most people did not question it. And I think what's interesting about the Kennedys is they questioned it, but they questioned it because it was put right before them, by the sit-ins. And then also, I think, they did travel a lot throughout the country in 1960, and they saw things. And I think that planted the seeds. And then once they were in office and had to respond, they were capable.
So that kind of leads to another question that we received, which was, said, I've talked to people who knew JFK, and some suggested that he was not as far along in understanding racial issues as his brother, Bobby. So by putting Bobby Kennedy in the Attorney General position and sort of setting him up to really lead on this issue, was that because JFK was disinterested in really devoting the time to it, or was it because he thought that Bobby possessed the skill to really lead on that issue?
The second. In my research, and again, I had all these, I didn't really think much about Kennedys at all, actually, but the assumption that historians, they didn't do enough. Thurgood Marshall, John F. Kennedy, when he was running for president, asked Thurgood Marshall, who was the lead, Brown lawyer and the leading civil rights lawyer in the country, asked him to come to the Senate and have lunch with him in April of 1960. And Marshall went. And Marshall recollected in this interview that was done right in 1964, right after Kennedy was killed, that he stayed there all afternoon. He said he understands everything. He understands about schools, he understands about voting, and he's committed to racial equality. Marshall understood the political constraints, but he was confident that Kennedy would go beyond the normal, So that was really a great find for me, because it explains, and that is why he asked his brother, because he knew that the Justice Department would drive the thing, because again, it was really going to be hard to get civil rights legislation through. And he knew his brother well. His brother had run his campaign in 1952. They traveled together through Vietnam, and so he was right. And there was a lot of criticism after Robert Kennedy was appointed. He doesn't have courtroom experience, this, that, and the other thing. And he said, look, he said, what we need is someone who knows how to run a great department, and getting the best people, finding the best people, getting them to do the work, he can do it. Nobody in the country could touch him. And the Justice Department he built, I mean, even the critics who had criticized the appointment, within months of that, they were saying, there's never been a Justice Department like this, and the commitment to public service and the talent, and not just talent, but he created an environment where you were a team. You work together. Nobody had rank. I mean, it was really terrific to learn more about that. But that was what President Kennedy saw, and he was correct. So I think it really sort of challenges that view of him as not being, they were different. They had different approaches, personalities, but they would join together in this, in really the ways that made things that happened possible.
So that flows beautifully into another question that we received, which was speaking specifically about Robert Kennedy's role as Attorney General and how he approached it and what he did. And you mentioned a couple things that he kind of changed in the culture of the Justice Department to make it work effectively. Do you think that he was really sort of precedent shifting in the way that he led the Justice Department, or was he did he have other examples of past occupants of that office to really see how it could be used as effectively?
I don't think there were too many past examples. And in terms of precedent, when he left, people in the department said it wasn't the same. And it wasn't that he kind of, one of the things he did as Attorney General, and again, this was the president pushed on this. In Prince Edward County, which is one of the cases that comprised Brown, came from Prince Edward County in Virginia, a majority Black county. When they were told they had to desegregate, they closed the schools and they set up private schools for the white students, and 1,700 Black students were left without schools. And this happened, I think, 1959 59, I'm pretty sure. And when the Kennedys came in, they focused on that immediately. And Robert Kennedy tried to allow the federal government to go in and sue the state. And that was kind of an edgy thing to try to do. And the judge said, no, that's not, you can't, you don't have that authority. So they ended up helping the NAACP lawyers who were going to take this case to the Supreme Court. And they ultimately got it there. But in the meantime, these children still were without schools. So in 1963, President Kennedy said to Burke, I want you all to do anything that's remotely legal and possible, and do something in that county. So Bobby Kennedy sent his friend Bill Vanden Heuvel down to Prince Edward County, and they ended up setting up a free school. And overnight, getting some support, hiring teachers from around the country, getting former Peace Corps volunteers. And in September of 1963, the Prince Edward County Free School opened in Farmville to all students, right? And a few white students went. But that was the Attorney General and his brother concern. And that didn't get a lot of publicity. People today don't remember that unless you live in Prince Edward County. But that really shows the depth of involvement, awareness, and concern, and going outside the box, and just finding a way to do it.
That's wonderful. So I think kind of following up on that too, in the sense of how Bobby Kennedy approached the various roles that he sort of moved and transitioned into throughout the 1960s. There was a question about his time in the Senate, and did he find a lot of close allies in the Senate? Was he sort of a outlier in the way that he approached the job of being a senator? How did he sort of maneuver in the legislative sphere composed to the executive sphere?
He allied himself with people who shared his concerns. I mean, he and Ribicoff had worked on this project for the pilot projects for youth in the early 60s. So yeah, and Clark was in, Joe Clark from Pennsylvania. They had field hearings to look at how the poverty programs are working around the country. So he found, he really gravitated in people who shared these concerns because they were front and center, what was happening in the cities. And same with Vietnam. As soon as he got to the Senate, he started meeting quietly with senators who were questioning the president's policy in Vietnam. And one thing Kennedy was very aware of, and it exists to this day with historians and people who, they get focused on this, he and Johnson didn't like each other, and that's it. And he knew that anything he did that seemed to be going up against Johnson would be reduced to a personality conflict, and the issue would be eclipsed. So this Vietnam War, I thought was really interesting, and he finally starts speaking out. No, so he, and again, he had that experience from the other side, working on the Civil Rights Act and the rest, and he knew how to be a team player, I mean, that was a real good quality.
Yeah, I mean, we see in history examples of people who are able to maneuver that transition from the executive side to the legislative side, where you have to have those teamwork skills to be able to, move the ideas forward that you want to move and champion. And not everybody's well equipped to do that.
No, it's a great quality to have. I think it's personality as well as. Yeah.
We had a couple questions that spoke a little bit more to Bobby Kennedy's, I think, personal life and his interests, perhaps. And one of those, I'll kind of pull two questions together here. And one was saying, did he sort of carry with him family values or a faith tradition that came from the Kennedy family? Did that sort of render itself in how he approached his public work? And then also there was a question about after his brother's assassination, someone mentioned that they had read that he sort of took to reading a lot of classics and Greek tragedies and things. And did you find that? And what do you think that kind of did for his way that he was mourning, but also processing this time of tremendous change for himself?
The first, I do think that his faith tradition was very important, but you can't just connect the dots. I think he was a spiritual person. He was a practicing Catholic, and he was a questioning Catholic. He would get into fights with priests he disagreed with, and he was close with Dan Berrigan. Out of that social justice tradition, I mean, John the 23rd was Pope during the early 60s and was very progressive in representing those views. So I'm really interested in trying to explore that more. It's kind of hard because he didn't write about it, but I do know he went to Mass every Sunday. But Kathleen Kennedy told me they went to church every Sunday, but Daddy would bring the Bible because he knew it was likely that the homily would not be worth listening to. So he'd read the Old Testament, I mean, it's, so he had, he did it his own way. But I do think it was important to him and he engaged in that way, but it, came from his family background. And then the second question about, yes, that is one of the comments of, he did read more in Greek tragedy, existential philosophy. As one of his friends said, he didn't, this didn't make him but he became more introspective after his brother's death. And those were reading and those works were very important to him. And he often quoted from the Greeks, So that, yes, that was, became an important part.
So one of our participants this evening was interested in, I know you mentioned some of his relationships with key leaders in the civil rights movement, but they were interested in particular in his relationship with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. How did they sort of, how did they meet or first come together, and what was that relationship like as they were sort of leading their respective parts of this movement?
That's a great question. It's something I was really interested in as I researched the book. I think they first met by telephone when King was trapped in that church in Montgomery and calling desperately. So that night was pretty intense. I think during the president, during his time as Attorney General, I think King came to the White House now and then, but they didn't, I didn't have evidence that they were in touch a lot. I mean, I think people are very busy and working on during that period. And then of course there is the point that always is brought up, and it should be, is that Robert Kennedy in October of '63 approved the wiretapping of King's telephone. And I mean, again, that's something I read about and talked to people about. And it's very interesting to try to understand why at that point he did that. I could get into it a little bit, but it's, there was this concern. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover, especially after the March on Washington and King's speech that really elevated him to all Americans, was furious. And he really wanted to bring King down. And he had one of his people do a report on King and the Communist Party, and he came back and said, there's no evidence that he is, and he said, you've got to be kidding, you're wrong. And so they went back and rewrote the report, and they said, oh yes, he does. And King had a relationship with Stanley Levinson, who had some association with the party in the 1950s, but there's no evidence that he was, but that's what he sort of fixated on. And the Kennedys asked King to stop talking to Levinson just because, and Hoover said he's still talking to Levinson. So in October of '63, they're trying to tee up the Civil Rights Bill. Hoover has the capacity to really leak stuff, to be an obstructionist for the Civil Rights Bill. So that's one pressure point. And the other is someone who was an associate of Bobby Kennedy said that Hoover had this information on the president about his romantic liaisons. So he had stuff. And so what Kennedy agreed to was a 1-month wiretap, and that they would come back and renew it. And what Kennedy believed, they'd find nothing. Even if you talk to Levinson, it would not be about anything subversive. And of course, President Kennedy was killed in November 22nd. Lyndon Johnson comes in, and even though Robert Kennedy would be Attorney General till the next August, Hoover never had to report to him again. He reported directly to Johnson. He was Johnson's guy. And so that and I think what people confuse is wiretapping and bugging. And the bugging of the hotel rooms that went on, you didn't need approval by the Attorney General. And Robert Kennedy did not know about that. And I think it happened very close to the end of JFK's term. So that said, when we move into the next part of Kennedy's life as a senator, they're very closely aligned. They come together around this issue of poverty, around the issue of the cities, and around the war. And their people are in touch. They really, King hoped that Robert Kennedy would run for president. So it's a really important period because their interests, their concerns, and what's happening in the country really brought them in close alignment. And of course, when Dr. King is assassinated, Robert Kennedy gives this speech just extemporaneously, this amazing speech, which everyone should look at. It's short, in Indianapolis that night, announcing to a mostly African-American crowd that King had been killed. And it is, and that was one of the speeches or something I knew about when I decided to go into the book. Who is this guy? You know, how did he become this person? So.
Well, I think a fitting question to sort of conclude our discussion tonight would be around sort of lessons that we take from this. You know, the Byrd Center does a lot of work in civics education where we take these people and moments in history and we look at how they can inform our understanding of American representative democracy and our course toward that more perfect union that's talked about in the founding of the nation. And I'm curious to know, after you've done this research, after you've written this book, what are things you're sharing with your students? What are things that you want us all to take away as lessons from Bobby Kennedy and his life and leadership that make us all better citizens and participants in American democracy?
Yeah, I'm always interested to hear my students' reactions when they read parts of it. But I think one of the most important things is citizenship, civic. I mean, you know, first of all, face our history, you know, face the problems. You know, if you have a question about something, learn about it and then figure out what you can do, you know. And I think that sounds simple, but that's essential. You know, and when you look at the period he moved through, I mean, what the civil rights movement accomplished because of that and having responsive people in government. But the wonderful speech by President Kennedy, the most important thing is that all of us in our own lives, you know, we must act. But I think it's also facing it. And I think your point about civic and citizenship, you know, our identities now have become consumers, you know, and people talk a lot about what's going on in politics. It's more like a sideshow, you know, to really, and I think history, this kind of history and these sorts of individuals who moved through this particular period, the ones who really stepped up and organized and joined together and really had faith in democracy, faith in the country. One part of the book that I really loved researching was I found these amazing sources about the sit-ins and about these reporters from Time magazine going down south to find these young people at these Black colleges who were doing this. And the interviews are fabulous because they basically talk about, it's not about a hamburger, it's not about going to the soda fountain, it's that we learned in school, you know, democracy, this is what democracy means, you know, and it's just to think those young people were willing to die. Now that's pretty extreme, right? But the point is and there was a kind of faith in the country, in the capacity of the country, and in the principles of the country. And I think that particularly, I really have them read that and the documents from that research, because it you know, people look at freedom riders and they think, isn't this great? And it's a very visual thing, but you know, what did they bring to this? Why did they do it? What were they thinking? And of course, they changed so many things about our country. So I think there are just many lessons. And I think Robert Kennedy, you know, and they never gave up. I mean, and again, they too had it, but it takes action, it's hard work, and it's informing yourself. And I really think the study of American history is really important for people to get their bearings and to understand the nature of the problems, the complexity. There's no clear path. You get involved, you learn, and you grow from there. But I think that's a great contribution of this history to everyone.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Patricia Sullivan, for this incredible talk and conversation tonight. Thank you all in the audience for joining us and for your wonderful questions to fuel our conversation. I want to leave you all with an invitation to join us for our next program coming up in about 2 weeks. And that is actually following up on the history that we've talked about and learned from tonight. because that program with Distinguished Professor of Journalism at Columbia University, Dr. Jelani Cobb, is going to be focusing on the Kerner Commission report, the recently reissued, which is called the Essential Kerner Commission report, but the original came out 4 months after the assassination of Robert Kennedy. And so we're going to continue in some ways this conversation and this pivotal decade in the history of American civil rights relationships on Wednesday, October 27th, 2021 at 7 p.m. right here on Zoom. I hope that you will join us for that program. And thank you all again tonight for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Patricia Sullivan. And thank you, Howard Wachtel, Marie Tyler McGraw, and Four Seasons Books for supporting this program tonight. Hope you all have a wonderful week.
Thanks all. Thank you. Bye.